Okay, so let's start talking about the really interesting part of this course. Let's start with XAML. And XAML is the language that you will be using to create user interface in your application, in your Windows Presentation Foundation application. And as you remember, we had this main window class. And the main window class had a main window.xaml and a main window.xaml.cs files. Now the one that we are interested in right now is the .xaml file. And you will have something very similar to this. And right now I'm just gonna delete this definition of a grid. We will be talking about grids in the coming lecture. Right now let me just explain to you a little bit about XAML. So in this case we have a definition of window, and this is the way to defining an element in XAML when you want to include more elements inside of it. Now, in this case, everything that we define inside of this window will be the content of a window, because content is the default property of window to be defined. So as you can see, we have some properties here of window, which is height and width, which of course define the height and width of the window. And in case we start defining things here, they will be part of the content of the window. Now, one other way to do this in a more specific way is to write window.content and here defining the content of a window, which really has the same result as the preview version. As you can see, I can write some text, and the same happens if I just delete this, because even though I'm not specifying it, content is the default property to be defined when writing something inside the definition of a window. Now the same happens with a text block. If I do this, we see that we can also see the text that I written inside of the definition of a text block in the layout. This is because text is the default property to be set when writing something inside of a definition of a text block. But I usually do this. I define the element and I set a value to a property. So in this case, I'm defining the element text block inside of the content of a window and setting the text property of the text block to text. And as you can see in the preview layout in Visual Studio, I can immediately see the changes that I'm applying to the user interface on XAML. To prove that this is actually happening, I will just run this project. And as you can see, it's the exact same thing that is appearing on the preview in Visual Studio. So this is a very important element that you will be defining in a lot of your Windows Presentation Foundation applications. Another important element is the text box. And in the preview looks pretty much the same, but there is a very important difference, and it is that a text box is actually editable by the user. So even though I can set the text right here, when I run this, the user is actually able to change the text. And that was not the case with the text block. So as you can see, it's very simple to define elements. For example, I can also define a button. And in this case, button doesn't have a property name text, but it does have a property name content. And we can see a button immediately applied to the layout or the preview layout in Visual Studio. Now, just to prove that this is a button, I can see that it changes when I hover over with the mouse. So there are a lot of elements that we can define, And in case you don't know the name of the elements, you can always go to the toolbox and search for the elements. Now, it's not something that I usually do to search for tools or elements in here and just move them, and it is possible, but it's not as powerful as defining them yourself when writing things on XAML. It's just a personal thing that I do and that I find way more powerful and way more controllable to write things on the XAML than to just drag and drop from the toolbox. So these are some elements, very simple elements that we can define in the XAML. So if you are defining a user interface, you can find IntelliSense very useful. IntelliSense is an autocomplete tool that comes with Visual Studio, and probably you've already seen it as I wrote something in here. So let me go ahead and define another text block again. And as you can see, as I start writing, IntelliSense tells me uh, or gives me a list of the things that I may want to define. And as I approach to the actual thing that I want to define, I can just select it, click enter, and finish the definition. And in fact, as I start writing inside of the definition, I get the list of the properties and events that I can use with this element. So if I start writing text, I get the text right there. So IntelliSense is very useful. What happens if I want to define more than one element? I get an error here, and it says that the property content of a window can only be established once. And in this case, what should we do if we can define more than one element? Well, actually we can define more than one element, but we will need a container to be the one, a father of the child element. So in this case, text block is a child element of window. Yes, but window can only be the property content of a window can only be set once. And if we want to define more than one element, we will be needing a container. And we will be talking about containers in the next lecture.